I've always said that crime scenes don't lie. People do. They act, they fake, they cry when they need to cry. But objects, they just sit there telling the truth quietly, if you know where to look. This one started with a phone. It was a Wednesday morning in early March, right outside Providence, Rhode Island. Cold, windy. I was called to a small 2-story home in a cul-de-sac. The report was simple: missing person. A young woman named Emily Reese, 29 years old, hadn't shown up to work in 2 days. Her sister had driven in from Fall River after Emily stopped responding to texts and calls. She found the house locked from the inside. The front door was deadbolt. The windows were shut. No signs of struggle. But Emily wasn't there. The first thing I noticed? Silence. Not absence of noise silence. Something deeper. The kind of stillness that clings to the walls, like the house itself was holding its breath. Everything inside was oddly clean. Not freshly cleaned. Too sterile. Like a model home in a catalog. The kind no one really lives in. Her phone was on the nightstand. Screen up, no charger connected. Battery at 78%. Now, that detail shouldn't have meant much. Maybe she charged it earlier and unplugged. Maybe it was on a wireless pad. Except it wasn't. I checked the whole room. No wireless charger. No plugged-in cord. Nothing under the bed. Nothing tucked behind furniture. The only charge in the house was still neatly coiled in a drawer in the hallway closet. I know, because I took pictures before touching anything. So how did the phone go from dead, because her sister said she couldn't reach her for over a day, to 78% charge if no one had plugged it in? I pocketed the question and kept looking. There was no sign of forced entry. But when I examined the back door's deadbolt, I noticed the screws were a bit too new, still shiny, and not a scratch on the flathead slots. The kind of clean you don't get unless the thing's been replaced recently. I started forming a picture in my head. A crime not of violence, but of silence. Someone had been there, not to kill, not to steal, but maybe to erase. Emily's bed was made, impeccably, pillows aligned, sheets tight. That bothered me. Most people don't make their beds perfectly before disappearing. In the bathroom, the mirror was spotless, but the sink had faint traces of toothpaste spatter, dried, probably from the day before. A used towel hung on the rack, but the laundry basket was empty. No dirty clothes anywhere in the house. Then I found her laptop. The history had been cleared. The trash bin had been emptied at 4:42 a.m., 2 nights prior. And yet, the file recovery showed an incomplete document. A draft of an email. Subject line: if anything happens to me, nothing else. No body text. The file stopped mid-keystroke. Almost like someone had pulled the plug. I circled back to the phone. Plugged it into the only charger in the house. It connected immediately. No issues. Battery holding steady. I asked her sister again. When was the last confirmed time she spoke with Emily? Monday night, she said. Around 10 p.m. She said she wasn't feeling well and was going to sleep early. That checked out with the text. But then there was a gap. No outgoing messages. No social activity. Just a phone that remained mysteriously charged. Later that day, forensics pulled prints from the charger found in the hallway drawer. Only Emily's. None recent. But here's what cracked it wide open. I requested cell tower logs. Emily's phone pinged a tower 20 minutes from her house at 2:17 a.m. Tuesday morning. And yet the house was locked from the inside when her sister arrived. Which meant only one thing. Someone else brought that phone back. Someone who knew her password. Someone who deleted that message draft. Someone who wiped her browsing history, replaced the bolt, and set the house up like a showroom. And someone who recharged her phone, but didn't know enough to think that would matter. We found Emily 2 days later. Alive, drugged, but shaken. She was being held in a remote property owned by her ex-boyfriend, Caleb Wexler, a man with no criminal record. Clean background, but a violent possessiveness that left no physical trace. Caleb had used Emily's car, her phone, her charger, then slipped back into her house to cover his tracks. But he forgot one thing. No one charges their phone without leaving a trace. That 78% told me everything. You'd be surprised how often the small things speak loudest. A fingerprint, a wrinkle, a plugged-in charger, or the absence of one, because silence always has a source. And phones don't lie. Not like people do. Some people think forensics is all about microscopes, chemicals, and lab coats. But sometimes it's about stopping in the middle of a room, squinting at a single shoe print, and asking yourself one very simple question. Why is it facing the wrong way? It was a cold morning in Boise, Idaho. A 34-year-old real estate agent named Derek Coleman had been found dead inside a newly listed home. The property was vacant, still staged for showings, barely touched since the last open house 3 days earlier. Derek had gone to photograph the property for a virtual tour. He never made it out. The patrol officer who found him said it looked like an accident. Derek was lying at the bottom of the staircase. Head at a bad angle, camera equipment scattered across the floor. One of the front steps had a bit of cracked wood. They thought he must have tripped. But here's the thing. Derek was wearing hiking boots with deep ridges on the soles. Thick, heavy. It would have taken more than a splintered step to throw him like that. When I got there, I did what I always do. I paused at the threshold and just looked, not for blood, not for weapons, for patterns. The house was silent, almost too staged, like it was trying to look innocent. Living room pristine. Dining table set with fake wine glasses. Not a cushion out of place. Derek's body had already been taken, but his equipment remained, bag open, tripod snapped in half like it had been stepped on. I moved to the staircase and noticed the first odd detail. A single muddy shoe print, half-dried, right near the top of the stairs. Not unusual, except for the direction. The print was facing up the stairs, which wouldn't mean much, except that Derek had fallen down. If he had slipped mid-step, his last print should have been facing downward, in the direction of his movement. This one said the person who made it was going up the stairs after the fall had already happened. That meant someone else had been there. Now I was listening differently. The air had a story to tell. There was more. On the landing, faint traces of transfer, a scuff mark on the baseboard, like a boot had scraped sideways. Another print barely visible near the guest room door. This one was also facing the wrong way. Someone had come back down the stairs. But no prints going up except the first. Whoever it was, they'd stepped up once, and then come back very carefully, without leaving more marks. I checked the doorknobs. The one to the guest room had faint oil smudges, not fingerprints, just residue, the kind left by gloves. Derek's camera was still on. I recovered the SD card. The last photo taken was of the upstairs hallway. It was blurry, tilted, as if the camera had moved mid-click, but you could make out the corner of a shadow, like someone had just turned around at the end of the corridor. I showed the photo to the officer who found the body. He swore there was no one upstairs when he arrived. No signs of anyone. But when we pulled the logs from the smart lock on the front door, we found something else. The door had been open at 11:03 a.m., which matched Derek's arrival. It locked again at 11:07. Then nothing. No unlock event. No alarm. But the back door, normally in use, had no digital log, just an old-fashioned key lock. That's when I remembered the listing agent saying a spare key was hidden under a planter in the backyard for last-minute contractors. I checked it. Still there, but covered in fresh dirt, recently moved. Someone had used the key, entered through the back, and never touched the front again. Security footage from a neighbor's Ring camera caught part of a black SUV idling a few houses down around 11 a.m. Can't see the plate, but you can see the silhouette of someone exiting on foot, tall, broad shoulders, wearing a cap. Now we had movement, motive, and a possible method. Derek had stumbled on someone upstairs. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A squatter? A thief? Maybe someone using the house as a front. But what sealed it wasn't the footage. It was that damn shoe print. Lab analysis showed it didn't match Derek's boots. It was a different size, slightly wider. Tread pattern suggested military-grade combat boots, heavier, denser rubber. Specialized. That pointed us to a man named Martin Greer. A former Army reservist turned private security. He'd done freelance real estate protection, code for cleaning up high-risk properties. Turns out, he'd been using the empty house as a drop point for stolen goods. Jewelry, mostly stuff that wouldn't draw attention. Derek had arrived unannounced and walked into a transaction in progress. Greer panicked, pushed him down the stairs, and made it look like a fall, then wiped everything he could, except for the one print he couldn't see, the one that faced the wrong way. He's serving 18 to 25 now, first-degree manslaughter. People always ask me how I caught him. They expect some big revelation, DNA, a confession, a hidden camera. But the truth is, I just saw the print. A single step that told the wrong story. Because in crime scenes, direction matters. And sometimes, all it takes is for one footprint to be turned the wrong way, to prove everything else was a lie. It was snowing hard when I got the call. A body had been found inside a small rental cabin on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. Middle of January. Temperature outside, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, not much better, except for one strange detail. The ceiling fan was on. It's the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. The kind of thing that doesn't scream murder, but whispers that something isn't right. The victim was a man named Gregory Holt, 41, divorced, a freelance journalist from Albuquerque. According to the property owner, he had booked a cabin for a week-long stay. Peace and quiet to finish a piece, he'd said. 3 days in, no checkout, no responses. Cleaning crew found him slumped in a chair near the fireplace. Laptop still open, cup of tea untouched. No signs of struggle, no wounds. Nothing missing. Fireplace out. Heater off. Window locked. Just Greg. A cold body in a colder room, and a ceiling fan quietly spinning above his head. Most cops would have closed the file within a day. Natural causes, maybe a stroke. But I've learned to stop and look for what doesn't fit. People don't run ceiling fans in the winter. Not unless they're trying to move air. But the fan wasn't on reverse. Wasn't pushing warm air down. It was set to high, blowing cold air straight down. And that was the first crack in the story. I checked the thermostat. It was off, manually switched. The log showed it had been active until around 2:12 a.m. on the night Greg died. Next, I opened his laptop. He was writing something titled The Silent Route. Looked like a long-form investigation. The doc had no formatting, no headers, just a flood of unedited text. But it caught my attention immediately. He was investigating a series of missing persons, truckers, mostly, who disappeared off a stretch of highway between Arizona and New Mexico. No clear connection between them, except that they'd all stopped at the same gas station in a ghost town called Navarro. Population, 0. An abandoned place with one functioning pump, still somehow operational. Greg was onto something. He mentioned hidden storage units, a former corrections officer with a sealed record, and a name that showed up again and again in police logs, but never in public reports. M. Halperin. Whoever Greg was writing about. He was nervous. His tone shifted halfway through the file. He wrote, "If anything happens to me, start here. Navarro. Halperin. The fan is the key." That last line stopped me. The fan is the key. I went back to the ceiling fan, pulled a chair under it, and looked closer. Nothing taped. No markings. But the blades had fine dust patterns on them. Except one. One blade was cleaner, as if something had been taped there and recently removed. That's when I noticed a wobble. On high speed, the fan shook slightly. Uneven weight distribution. So I took it apart. Inside the central mount, taped against the wiring panel, was a micro SD card. No label, just data. It contained video footage. No sound, just a single static angle, pointing at the front door of the cabin. The timestamp, same night Greg died. You see Greg pacing the room, stressed, maybe anxious. He types something on the laptop, sits, gets up again. Then suddenly, he freezes. The door handle moves. Greg stands still, watching. Someone opens the door. He doesn't fight, doesn't scream, just backs up. The person steps inside, out of frame. Then Greg falls to the floor. Not violently, just drops. The footage ends. No attack visible. No weapon. No physical confrontation. Toxicology later revealed he'd been dosed with something called atorphine, an ultra-potent opioid used to sedate large animals. Nearly impossible to trace unless you're specifically looking for it. The kind of thing you don't find in regular black market channels. But the kind of thing a former prison medic might still have access to. M. Halperin was real. Martin Halperin, former medic at a now-defunct private correctional facility that once sat along the very same highway Greg had been investigating. He'd vanished from public records years ago, quietly retired. But a bank trace revealed rent payments made to the cabin's owner, under a fake name, every month for nearly a year. Greg was lured there, not for peace, but silence. The killer used a ceiling fan for one reason: airflow, to keep the air moving and delay lividity and rigor, just enough to throw off the estimated time of death. Smart, clinical, almost perfect. But he forgot one thing. Greg was a reporter, and reporters don't just write. They hide things. The fan wasn't just running. It was pointing to his final clue. Halpern was found 6 weeks later in a storage container outside Gallup, New Mexico. Inside, they found multiple ID cards, a surgical-grade tranquilizer gun, and a list of names. All missing persons. Greg was right. He just didn't live long enough to publish it. But sometimes, justice starts with something as simple as a fan that shouldn't have been spinning. And a man who knew, even in his final moments, where to leave the truth. It was found in his pocket. Just one key, no label, no keychain, nothing to identify what it belonged to. That wouldn't have been strange, except the fact that the victim didn't own a car, didn't rent a storage unit, didn't even have a mailbox that required a key. And yet, he carried it everywhere. The body belonged to Edward Parrish, 59, retired civil engineer. Lived alone in a one-story brick house in Poughkeepsie, New York. Quiet guy. Routine as hell. Walked the same path every morning, same groceries on receipt, same diner booth every Sunday. No close family, no debts, no vices. He was found dead in his backyard, lying next to his shed. Heart failure, supposedly. The first officers on the scene were ready to call it natural death, but the neighbor, Mrs. Langford, 78, a chronic people watcher, insisted something was off. She told me that shed door was open the night before. I saw it. Now it's closed, locked tight. Ed never left it open unless he was inside, and I never saw him come out. When I arrived, the shed was indeed locked. Padlock rusted, typical. I asked the forensics team if they'd checked inside, yet they hadn't. No key on the man, they said, but that wasn't true. I checked his right coat pocket. One small brass key. I tried it on the shed padlock. Didn't fit. Then I tried the back door. Then the garage. Then the mailbox. Nothing. That key didn't open anything in his house. I had the locks disassembled. No match to the teeth pattern. It wasn't cut for any of the locks in that home. And that's when I knew this key wasn't just out of place. It was the clue. The kind of detail someone forgets to erase when they clean up a crime scene. Inside Edward's house, nothing looked disturbed, but on the dining table, there was an envelope. No stamp, no writing, just one piece of paper inside, folded once, typed words. We both know it's not about the key. I felt it, that creeping unease. When a message isn't meant for you, but you're the one reading it. I had the key analyzed. No fingerprints except Edward's. No manufacturer logo, but it faint residue. Iron oxide. Rust, not from the key itself, but transferred, like it had been used in something old, possibly underground, maybe even exposed to salt water at some point. I started digging. Edward's financials were clean, except for one unusual payment every month to an LLC registered in Delaware. Shell company. Of course, the money trail led to a property in upstate New York. Abandoned warehouse near the river. Fenced off, officially unused. I went there. Inside, after bypassing a rusted sliding door, I found an elevator shaft non-functioning. But at the base, hidden under a metal panel, was an old wall-mounted safe. It had no dial, just a keyhole. The key fit perfectly, but the safe was empty. Only dust. Dust and a faint circular outline where something had once been, like a hard drive. Now I was sure, whatever Edward had, someone took it, and they took it fast. I started asking around about Edward's past. Turned out, 15 years ago, he had been part of a team contracted by the state to design security infrastructure for data centers. Nothing illegal, just layouts, airflow systems, maintenance access. But that gave him insider knowledge of vulnerabilities, like where the data vaults were, which ones had no surveillance inside, and more importantly, how to disappear something inside a lockbox no one knew existed. The key wasn't a mystery. It was a leftover, a piece of a puzzle someone else finished. But sloppily, because whoever came for Edward didn't realize one thing. Old engineers don't forget systems. They build redundancies. Back in his bedroom closet, I found a second envelope taped beneath a shelf. Inside, a backup drive. Encrypted, but we cracked it 2 weeks later. Emails, schematics, logs. Edward had found out someone was using the abandoned state facility to launder stolen data, financial records, corporate espionage, even classified communications. He'd kept a record, and he was planning to go public. But they got to him first, and they made a mistake. They left the key. A key that didn't open anything anymore, but it told the story. Edward knew they'd come, so he left the thing most killers ignore, something pointless. A key that no longer served a function, except to raise a question. And questions, that's how investigations begin. Some crime scenes scream. Others whisper. This one didn't make a sound. It was a modest kitchen in a 2-bedroom rental in Tacoma, Washington. White tile counters, outdated appliances, and a stainless steel sink filled to the brim. Not with blood, not with tools or prints. With murky, cold water. Standing water, unmoving, not bubbling, not draining, just stuck. And somehow, that sink was what kept pulling me back. The victim was Vanessa Rowe, 36, freelance illustrator, found dead in her bedroom, in bed, fully dressed, no signs of struggle, no forced entry. The cause of death was initially ruled as a stroke, natural causes. But something about that didn't sit right with her sister, Dana. She told me Vanessa hated clutter. She was obsessive about cleaning. That sink would have never been left like that. She was right. Every room in the house was spotless. Floors vacuumed. No dishes in the drying rack. The only thing off was that sink, filled with water that refused to move, even when I pulled the stopper and tested the drain myself. I know what you're thinking. So what? It's plumbing. Things clog. But that's the kind of thinking that gets you nowhere in my line of work. Because sometimes, what looks like plumbing is something else entirely. The water in the sink was slightly warm. Not hot, but not room temp either. Like it had been run about an hour before I got there. That didn't make sense. Vanessa was pronounced dead nearly 8 hours before that. So who turned on the tap? I started tracing her last 48 hours. No social activity. No deliveries. No outgoing calls after 7:42 p.m. the night before. But she did receive a voicemail from an unknown number. It said only 3 words. Don't trust it. Not him. Not them. It. That voicemail was deleted an hour later, but the system log caught the deletion time, 2:21 a.m. Vanessa had already been dead by then, so someone was in that house. The front door lock had no signs of forced entry, and neither did the windows. But the back door, it had a soft scratch near the latch, almost invisible to the naked eye, the kind you make when you're careful, professional. But here's the twist. Nothing was taken. No laptop, no wallet, No documents, except her cell phone. I went back to the sink. Underneath the drain, I found something odd. Duct tape, wrapped inside the U-bend, hidden behind a PVC joint. Not sealing anything, just wedged deep into the curve. When I removed it, the small plastic capsule fell out. Inside, a micro SD card. It was labeled in tiny handwriting. For JR, it took me a second to realize. JR, that's me, Jack Ramsey. Vanessa and I had crossed paths once years ago. She'd testified as a key witness in a fraud case I was working. A contractor who had siphoned hundreds of thousands in bribes through manipulated blueprints. She'd tipped me off, quietly, anonymously, and we'd kept that silence. The SD card held files, hundreds of scanned documents, sketches, and emails. Vanessa had uncovered a new scheme. Someone was using architectural renderings to hide access routes in city infrastructure. Plans were being doctored, digital blueprints overwritten to create blind spots in camera networks and physical barriers. It was how certain robberies had been pulled off without ever tripping alarms. And it tied back to the same name from the old case, Marcus Penn, the contractor who got 5 years and got out in 2. She had discovered he was doing it again, only this time the scale was bigger. She'd hidden the evidence where no one would think to look, and she'd known. She'd known they were watching her. The sink was her signal, her warning. It hadn't drained, not because it was clogged, but because she had blocked it on purpose. She knew if I ever saw a dirty sink in her home, I'd dig. And I did. Turns out Marcus had been using tech firms to mask building permits under shell company names. Vanessa had drawn overlays, layer by layer, exposing where real walls had been built over false entrances, camera angles redirected by mirror glass, even utility paths rerouted to carry more than just water and gas. This was more than construction fraud. It was about staging the perfect environment for crimes to happen unnoticed. But she'd gotten too close. And someone made sure she wouldn't testify again. The official record still says natural causes. But I've got the drive. And now, I've got a blueprint of something they never wanted anyone to see. The last line in Vanessa's handwritten note was what stuck with me most. If you're reading this, Jack, don't look at the walls. Look under them. That sink never drained, but it poured out a truth no one else could see.